Okay, hello everybody. Welcome and thanks very much for joining us for today's webinar on Government for an Agri-Food Revolution, Lessons from Whitehall and History. I think it's going to be a really interesting one. We have two great speakers for you, and the aim is to really get us all thinking a bit differently about governing climate change and the transformation of the agri-food system, and thinking more about what actually is possible. So I'm Des Fredenberg, and I'm based at the Tyndall Centre for Climate Change Research at the University of East Anglia. I'm the Knowledge Exchange Fellow for the AFN Network Plus, and work on this webinar series with my colleague Neil Ward, who's speaking today. The AFN Network Plus is focused on the UK Agri-Food System and identifying the research barriers to transitioning to a net zero UK by 2050. It's funded by UKRI, the umbrella body for the British Research Councils, and is coordinated by the University of East Anglia, York, Leeds and West of England. We've got 800 plus people and organisations now in the network. So if you've got an interest or expertise in this topic, please do join us. We host activities, events, produce resources and give out funding. And I think John, my colleague, will put web links in the chat in a second. So today is the 7th webinar in our series, and we're very pleased to have Jill Rutter and Neil Ward speaking. They're each going to talk about 15 minutes, and then we'll open things up for questions. So please do jot things down and have them ready at the end. You can put them in the chat function or in the Q&A box. So Jill is a senior fellow at the Institute for Government, a think tank that researches how to make government more effective. Before joining the Institute, Jill spent most of her career in the civil service, working at the Treasury, Number 10, and most recently at the Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs. Jill is a regular commentator on a wide range of issues about government, the civil service and Brexit. She's employed as a senior research fellow at UK and the Changing Europe at King's College London, and is an advisor to the National Infrastructure Commission on net zero. So we're really interested to hear her insights in a bit, and we will keep on time as well because Jill has to go to the cricket a bit later, don't you? So, yeah. Neil Ward is a co-convener of the AFN Network Plus and a professor of rural and regional development at the Tyndall Centre for Climate Change at UEA. He's been a director of the Centre for Rural Economy and also worked for periods on secondment to the Cabinet Office. His latest book is Net Zero Food and Farming, Climate Change and the UK Agri-Food System. So Neil is going to start things off. He's going to be looking back at previous revolutions and the government's role in that. He's going to get us all thinking about whether we need to reimagine the state's role in our food system and how we might be boxed in by our own thinking. So Neil, are you ready with your slides? Are you ready with your slides? Yeah. So we'll be recording we're obviously recording the session, so if you've got questions, best to kind of probably email them to us afterwards rather than putting them in the chat function if you don't want to be identified by anyone. We've got me on two different things right now. Are you able to share? You need to share a different screen, I think.
Can you see my slides?
No, I can see myself twice at the moment.
Right, let's.
That's it.
How's that? You can see them?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah,
I'm going to. Okay, and you can hear me okay?
Yeah, all good.
Okay, thanks very much. So I'm going to talk about net zero and the UK agri-food and land system as an issue for government by way of introduction before we turn to Jill. Avoiding catastrophic climate change is a race against time, but the net zero transition should at least be an opportunity to plan over a 25 to 30-year period. Politicians and commentators on the political right at the moment are arguing about whether net zero is too onerous, too costly, or too arbitrary. Climate change scientists, on the other hand, are worrying that the urgent need for immediate action is undermined by targets that are set some way off over decades. Compared to other sectors, the government's approach to agri-food and land for net zero has been criticised, particularly by the Climate Change Committee, the government's statutory advisor on climate change and net zero, as lacking in vision, as lacking in having a plan, and as lacking in progress. However, the need for change is, I think, increasingly accepted. Citizens generally see the need for climate action and also increasingly recognise the public health crisis around diet, which is really proving quite costly for the NHS, and the projections on that are quite serious in terms of public spending over the next couple of decades. Food companies, we're told, through the National Food Strategy and the Henry Dimbleby's work on this, sense that change is coming and ask principally for a level playing field. And there's a surge of interest amongst farmers in novel approaches such as regenerative farming. And you only need to look at the attendance of festivals like Groundswell over the last 3 or 4 years to see that there is surging interest in new approaches to agriculture and land management. To achieve net zero by 2050, we're going to need bold and ambitious change. And when it comes to the agri-food system, that change is probably more radical than many people realise. And this year's global temperatures and extreme weather events only underline and reinforce arguments about the urgency for action. But despite the strong grip of a sort of market-based paradigm of the last 40 years, the role of government in climate action is really important. It's critical, really. The post-war decades showed that when it comes to the agri-food system, the system can be actively transformed to deliver new national priorities. Governments always shape markets and can act to ensure fairness in systems transitions. So why is there a sense that we might be a bit stuck in the mud at the moment in the UK? Well, to plan the transition, we need to step back and see the bigger picture. So key change agents and the wider public will need to be able to understand the broader social and governmental choices that can sometimes be hard to see. So current taken for granted assumptions about what government can and should do have to be openly thought about and questioned. Ideas about the nanny state and things like that. We often see the world and the possibilities for governments within it through a lens of free market economics. However, ideas about regulating and managing markets do change over time, and they also differ between different places. You can see differences in emphasis between England, Scotland and Wales, let alone when it comes to looking at what's happening in the United States at the moment, for example. So we sometimes suffer from a sort of boxed-in thinking around the legitimate scope for action by government. And I think that partly explains why in the UK we're stuck in the mud a bit at the moment when it comes to agri-food and net zero. Dominant technological paradigms, so ideas about what's the natural technological order of things around questions of mechanisation, intensification, agrochemical use and so on, they also shape what we imagine to be possible and sensible. Governments and regulation have a role in supporting innovation and helping building new technological paradigms and getting them established. We should probably be careful about a sort of over-reliance on technological solutions to transform the agri-food system. And I would argue we need to break out of parochial thinking. We need to look at what other countries think and how they're doing things differently, and we need to actively reimagine what is possible through partnership between public sector bodies and the commercial world. So what sort of alternatives are out there that are floating around in the UK? Well, economist Mariana Mazzucato writes of a much more active role for the state in helping to drive and support innovation and economic growth. She's written about a really interesting book on the the NASA mission to get a man on the moon as an example of what she calls a mission economy. And this concept of a mission economy, when you read Mazzucato's writings, it's quite striking how it resonates with the experience in the 1940s and 1950s of establishing the policy model that we had for our agri-food system that we developed at that time. We've also had a few knocks and shocks to the system over recent years, and crises bring opportunities to reconsider our fundamental assumptions and disrupt prevailing paradigms. They reveal patterns and interdependencies that were previously hidden. A lesson of COVID is that people tend to welcome state action when it's about keeping them safe. How can we capture the inventiveness of the COVID response and use the COVID experience to look at agri-food and net zero anew? There are options as well about how we might frame the rationale and the approach to the transition of the agri-food system. There's the responding to the climate crisis, of course, but there's also the public health crisis driven by poor diet. Both are equally disruptive of the status quo and the current paradigm, although both seem to play out in different ways when it comes to public acceptability and patterns of behaviour change across the population. So an agricultural strategy and a land use strategy that is driven by a public health mission would look quite different to the current approach, for example. Just to reflect on some lessons from history and relatively recent history within living memory. So state-led transformation of the agri-food system in the UK has been done before. And the post-war revolution in the UK agri-food system was not the result of just market forces at work, but really much more of a highly purposeful state-orchestrated action. A subsidy and incentives framework was established to oil the wheels of change. Institutional relationships between the government and key stakeholders were very carefully structured and managed. The Ministry of Agriculture and the National Farmers Union would sit down annually and discuss prices and costs and set subsidy levels together. An extensive network of research, extension and advisory bodies was established to enable the state to play a central role in the promotion and extension and orchestration of technological change, especially when it comes to things like mechanization and the adoption of agrochemicals. So these carrots, these financial and advisory carrots, were accompanied by regulatory stick, which was quite strong in comparison with anything we've had since. So farmers were subject to supervision orders and even dispossession through a system of county executive committees that almost policed what constituted good agricultural practice in their areas. So this institutional policy framework actively orchestrated the adoption of new modern techniques to raise productivity. It led to the profound specialization of food production, different parts of the country becoming more specialized in wholly arable or wholly livestock production, transformations in breeding and feeding, and the routinized and prophylactic use of agrochemicals. So everyday practice in farms and fields was transformed, quite radically transformed. With things like agrochemicals, state-sponsored research in a growing network of research institutes, and a close collaboration between companies and the public sector, and an active and purposeful extension advisory system all help stimulate the widespread adoption of new approaches. And the regime works so well in its own terms because of a unity of purpose between farmers, agri-tech companies, and the state. This revolution in agricultural productivity was breathtaking in its scale. So cereal acreage grew by 75% between 1950 and 1984. Potato yields in the UK more than doubled between the 1940s and the 1980s per hectare. Beef production more than doubled pre-war levels by 1975. Milk production had doubled by the 1980s. So we should not just celebrate these successes of the productivist regime in terms of expanding production, but also strive to understand the institutional structures and the mixes of incentives and disincentives around innovation and delivery that helped ensure these successes. I think materially, the changes that we need to go through to 2050 are probably more modest than those that unfolded in the post-war period, but they are more challenging in terms of mindset, the social values amongst consumers and land managers, and the sort of breadth of imagination required among sector leaders and policymakers. We don't currently have the institutional instruments nor the unity of purpose that characterise this former period of radical change. Paradoxically, the British state is much bigger, it's more expensive, and extends into a much wider range of our lives than it did in the 1950s. And yet, paradoxically, our institutions appear weakened and fragmented with much less ambition than then. So a successful agri-food system transition to address the UK's net zero objectives and the public health crisis are going to require much more than a focus on agri-tech, on carbon audit tools, plant-based foods, and an elaborate set of environmental land management schemes to try and encourage changes in farming practice. What we're really going to need is a clearer vision, a bolder sense of ambition, and to rethink how the public and private sector can work together, as they have so successfully in the past, to drive change, and with an urgency that is currently absent. So last year, Lord Deben, John Gummer, who had chaired the Climate Change Committee for I think about 10 years, was asked to reflect on that experience in front of the Environmental Audit Committee, talking about net zero, and asked to talk about what the biggest challenges were. And he said his biggest reflection is that our real problems are institutional, and the fundamental changes we need to make about the government, how way the government works, about the relationships between central government, local government, and of course the national government, and an attitude of can do, and also the relationships between departments. So I thought it was quite striking that he thought the biggest challenge was not a technological one, and was not necessarily one about the public and behaviour change, but was one about how our institutions work and work together. So I thought that would be a good point to end on before we turn to Jill. That's a very brief run through my thoughts. If you were interested in a more expansive discussion of this, then Net Zero Food and Farming was published last year, and you can read about it there. Thank you. I'll stop sharing, Jez.
Brilliant. Thanks, Neil. That's absolutely brilliant. That was really interesting. Fantastic. So we're going to hand over to Jill now. Jill, I don't think you've got slides, have you? So I will just hand straight over.
No, I've just got slides to
Jill,
text on it, so I will speak from them, but I'm not going to follow them slavishly, so I'm not going to put them up, so you can't see how I'm deviating from what I first thought of. So I think it's very interesting that Neil ended with Lord Deben saying it's the institutions. I'm not totally and utterly convinced about that. We'll come on to that. But one of the things that I was asked to do was talk about lessons from history and where has the government been good at meeting cross-cutting challenges. And if you like, the bad news is that this is something that government isn't very good at. Government knows it's not very good at. And actually, the architecture put in place, and I'm going to use the word that seemed to have gone out of fashion slightly since Boris Johnson, Matt Hancock left the scene. But I mean, the UK government framework around climate change was generally regarded as a world-leading, if not world-beating set of architecture, and has been picked up and copied in other countries, not least the process of setting carbon budgets a legislated target and having the oversight from the Independent Climate Change Committee. So actually, that's an area where we have made more progress, arguably, and in a lot of other areas, if you're looking at lots of other of these difficult cross-cutting challenges, people actually look to the climate change net zero model as something to aspire to, rather than something that, well, that's not working, so let's move on there. So so going to say, hold that thought. The cabinet secretary, last cabinet secretary but one, somebody called Mark Sedwill, set up a series of programs across government that he was very keen to adapt an approach for cross-cutting problems that he thought had worked well on the UK's response to Russia. This is pre the February 2022 invasion of Ukraine. So I'll leave it to you whether this really had worked that well. But he had a strategy called fusion, which he thought was the way to get not just Whitehall departments to work better together, but also to get Whitehall to work better with the wider public sector. The problem is, and this is going to be a bit of a repeat theme from some of my talk, is that before he had any chance to prove the concept of fusion, he found himself no longer cabinet secretary, and that is one of the repeated problems that we have. So while Lord Deben thinks a lot of the problems in the institution, I think there are lots of problems as well in the personnel that populate those institutions, both their prioritization, but also their staying power, which I think is a really big problem. Anyway, let me find my slides, which seem to have gone completely missing in action. No. Anyway, so what do we know about this? I mean, as Neil has told us, the latest climate change committee assessment is that while the UK is on track for the fourth carbon budget, helped a bit by COVID, it looks as though it's off track for the sixth carbon budget, and I think the ambitious nationally determined contribution that Boris Johnson announced for 2030 at COP26. That assessment was done before the recent rhetorical, at least, backtracking, and before the failure of the latest offshore wind auction, which I think is really quite a big and bad setback, because one of the things that's been very noticeable in the UK success on net zero, and this I think does speak a bit to the institutional issues, is that progress had been fastest in the power sector. Why had progress been fastest in the power sector? Because that was the responsibility of the department that was also the lead on climate change. For everybody else, for every other government department, and this is the bit that really matters, you know, climate change is something, net zero is something to do, but it's not necessarily your top priority. We've seen that very much in the area of housing, which is a continuing area where the Climate Change Committee says we're really quite badly off track. We've seen it until Grant Shapps became Transport Secretary, really regarded as a sort of, you know, not really a priority by successive Transport Secretaries. And there have been a lot of Transport Secretaries. We now see EV uptake proceeding faster than both the government and the Climate Change Committee expected, but real problems with the provision of the infrastructure for charging, where there's very, very complex and not very satisfactory governance in place. And since the Ukraine invasion, all of that net zero ambition has been overlain by additional fears. It's always been the sort of energy, if you like, sort of trilemma, fears about affordability of energy and about energy security. And those have arguably taken the government focus away from net zero as the overriding priority, which I think it was back in 2019 when Theresa May set that net zero target, and actually was for Boris Johnson to an extent, though in a very Boris Johnson-y way of loving sort of big tech and just assuming that the numbers would add up if you hoped and crossed your fingers behind your back. I think there are two really, really interesting areas with different issues where the CCC singles out little progress. There's the demand side. The government is very reluctant to talk about the demand side across a whole range of areas. Remember their reluctance even to introduce an energy efficiency campaign in the wake of the Ukraine invasion and the big hike in prices. They're very nervous about any talk about modal shift, whether it's reducing flying or walking and cycling rather than using cars. the issue that they're most allergic to, absolutely no-go area in government at the moment, is reducing meat consumption. The other area where I think different issues apply is on the whole side of land use. I think the government would actually, if there are lots of tech solutions like tech solutions, this is a tech solutionist approach to net zero that we have at the moment. But those are on the what to do side rather than where are the institutions getting in the way. So let's look at where institutions might be getting in the way, and I think it's institutions and politics to an extent. So why so little progress? I think there's definitely nervousness about consumer reaction, nannying, and we've seen that repeatedly. And I think one of the really interesting messages, certainly from Action on things like smoking, is that government runs behind public opinion quite often. It listens more to the very siren voices you get in the newspapers about the unacceptability of government interventionism, where actually if you look to consumer opinion and put that aside, you'll find that actually the consumers tend to think that if something's important, the government should probably do it, and take the message from government inaction that maybe it's not as important as people claim it is. So I think, but governments of both colours are super nervous about consumer reactions and nannying. On the sort of DEFRA side, I think, and farming, I think there's a whole range of issues going on here which explain why the net zero strategy for farming is missing in action. DEFRA is a department that has been transformed by Brexit. It has changed in size between 2009 and 2016. DEFRA suffered some of the biggest cuts in Whitehall. Since then, DEFRA has massively expanded inside, but it's not expanded in size to deal either with net zero or indeed with the area where DEFRA leads, which is climate change adaptation. It's expanded in size to take on huge amounts of work that used to be done in the EU. It's trying to implement its new farm payment scheme. It's sort of trying to ride two horses between the environment and the NFU. Thought for quite a long time it had both on board, and I think now it's finding rather more predictably that it's pleasing neither, but it's got a huge big job around agricultural reform. It's had to legislate to put new institutions in place to make up for the loss of the institutional framework that we had in the EU. It was absolutely the forefront of something called the Retained EU Law Bill, which has required it to sort of go through the back catalogue of EU law that was transferred over onto the EU's and to the UK statute book. So that's an absolutely massive agenda. It's also trying to protect farm interests in trade deals and make sure it has the sort of freedom to act in areas which might be necessary, and has a very conflicted relationship with the Department for International Trade, as former Secretary of State George Eustice made absolutely clear when he denounced the Australia trade deal as giving away too much. So it's, a department with a huge amount on its plate, as well as the sort of, business as usual of animal disease, etc., all those sorts of things that can be existential for a department like that. It's suddenly, post-Ukraine, you might argue post the 2008-9 crisis, got to worry much more than it thought it had to about food security and food affordability and supply chains. I think food supply chains, one of the big discoveries of the Brexit process about how complex they were. In some ways, I'm trying to understand those through the Brexit process stood them quite well to deal with the potential disruptions to food supply chains in COVID. But those are big issues that they have to concern. And I think they've overtaken the concerns about net zero. And I think that's one reason why the Dimbleby report landed into a department that really wasn't by then that interested. And I think that reflects another issue, which again is affecting government concentration. As Neil has said, this is a very long-term project. But Dimbleby was commissioned by Michael Gove when he was DEFRA Secretary of State. Since then, we have been through quite a few other Secretaries of State. Last year, they had George Eustice, they had Ranil Jayawardena, and then they had Therese Coffey. Each came with their own agenda, different priorities. George Eustice came more from the farming side than Michael Gove, who's very on the purist public goods side. Ranil Jayawardena was a free markets for everything and shifting back, I think, briefly towards sort of basic payments. Therese Coffey is not a big player, and her name is constantly mentioned in potential reshuffles. So DEFRA may be facing in November, when Rishi Sunak finally gets round to his final reshuffle, may be facing yet more ministerial churn. And that makes it really, really difficult. But there are further problems for DEFRA. You see this particularly on adaptation, but even you see that DEFRA is a weak department in Whitehall terms. It's a department where I think you get, my analysis of DEFRA, you get one Secretary of State with a bit of clout around Whitehall every 10 years. And as a DEFRA official, you have to sort of maximize that, what Michael Gove might have called unfrozen moment or powerful moment, and then hope that that can get you enough sort of ground in Whitehall terms that the second, third order players you get coming afterwards don't see that too far eroded. So it's really difficult. And then I think you come down to how net zero is being delivered elsewhere. In the rest of the areas where we're looking at net zero, there are concentrated private sector players who are running with this agenda. And notwithstanding the NFU producing their net zero by 2040 report, farms on their own are not big enough, not well financed enough, really to be big drivers of progress without government talk. It's very interesting that Neil was highlighting the activism of his productivist revolution with a big role for the state. In other areas, I think the government is being outpaced by the private sector on climate change, which is why government sort of humming and hawing doesn't matter so much. But I think agriculture is an area where that's likely to be a problem. So what might you do about it? One of the answers you sometimes have is machinery of government changes. Should agricultural net zero go into the climate change department, now the Department of Energy Security, and net zero? And if you want a sort of token of how net zero has fallen down this government agenda, just look at the email addresses for the Department of Energy Security and net zero. It's not netzero.gov.uk, it's not even desnes.gov.uk, it's energysecurity.gov.uk. But it's pretty unlikely, I think, that you would merge that back into that department. We had that when DEFRA was the lead on climate change, but we didn't have the energy system in there yet. So I think that would make a department that was too unwieldy and unlikely to happen with all those other things on the DEFRA agenda. Absolutely critical, and something that is completely missing at the moment, I think, is to send the signal through Whitehall that this is an absolute prime ministerial priority, and a prime ministerial priority where the prime minister is prepared to lay down the law and tell departments that this is absolutely, tell his secretary this is absolutely what he wants them to get on with, and that he's willing to face down opponents both within his own party and across public opinion. I don't think we see that. You can try and deal with some of these problems by pooling resources and money, but I think this is an area where DEFRA is not going to be a big recipient of extra cash. There isn't that much extra cash to go round. There are big other demands on public spending at the moment. And indeed, once the protection on the CAP inherited money ends at the end of this parliament, I think the Treasury will regard agricultural support very much as fair game. So DEFRA will be fighting to hang on to what they've got rather than getting lots of extra. So this will be talking about redirecting funds within a specified and perhaps shrinking envelope. There are other things you can do inside government, and we've actually got some of those on climate change, net zero already, cross-cutting units, delivery units to track progress. There is a delivery unit, I'm not sure how much it does, on net zero. I think there is a big role for a much beefed up Cabinet Office unit to track that, and maybe that will happen under another government. But critical, I think, is if you really, really want to make a difference to this, but I don't think it's going to happen probably under either this government or indeed an incoming Labour government, is the appointment of a big hitter. As we said, Keir Starmer's environment secretaries change about as often as the government ones do, and it's often quite difficult to remember who is doing that job now. Indeed, I had to look up who was the current environment secretary. It's Steve Reed, if you've forgotten. So what needs to change? So if the current government is going to do anything differently, I think it needs the Prime Minister to embrace this agenda, to show it's come back as a top priority. And if he is going to replace Therese Coffey, replace that with somebody who has some Whitehall clout and for whom changing agriculture to make it a contributor to net zero is a big priority. Watch this space. I'm not sure that's going to happen. But I think they're really, really interesting questions about where this fits with Labour. Labour, as Neil was saying, has made a lot of what it calls mission-led government. Sue Gray, the former Cabinet Office senior civil servant, has just gone to be Chief of Staff to Keir Starmer. I think one of her top missions will be to define what is different about mission-led government, and what does that look like? And does that mean that rather than just rely on lots of lowest common denominator cabinet committee discussions, we have cabinet committees on net zero, does it actually adopt a much more proactive sort of task force approach to government? But then I think there's another question, because if you read the Labour mission about net zero, it talks about making the UK a clean energy superpower. That probably means more onshore wind, probably means more solar panels, but where does peatland restoration fit in? Where does changing diet fit in? It's not clear to me that that's in their mission. Nor is it clear that, you know, agriculture, the agricultural transition will be a priority for the funding. It's been scaled back to, I think, a more realistic profile now, but Labour has made it very clear they want to live within their fiscal rules. How will Labour reprofile that spending? Will agriculture get anything for an agricultural transition? I think that's a really interesting question. Will they be as frightened about nannying? As I said, the track record is that in many ways, Labour governments are even more nervous about being accused of being nannies because, you know, the right-wing media thinks that's their natural tendency, and we've seen examples there. Or will public opinion move ahead of them? Maybe public opinion on diet is moving faster in many ways than political opinion is. Let's see. And I think the final thing is, how influenced will they be by the farm lobby? When I was at DEFRA under a Labour government, the Treasury always had huge ambitions to take money out of farming to make farmers bear some of the costs of dealing with animal diseases. Every single time that DEFRA tried to make any of the changes that the Treasury was trying to inflict on it, Number 10 would resile from those. And I think it'd be very interesting to see how that relationship develops. So I think there are no obvious organizational magic bullets. I think the absolutely critical thing is, if you want progress, you need this to be the political priority of a very powerful Secretary of State.
Brilliant. Thank you, Jill. That was really interesting. And we've got quite a lot of questions coming in. I'm going to try and combine a few, because I think one thing that came through really strongly was this, the fact that you said ministers and secretaries of state move around a lot. There's not that consistency of sort of expertise, and DEFRA doesn't always get those sort of big hitters. And I'm just sort of wondering if there are any sort of other models around the world where that is a bit different, where we have sort of more expertise of those ministerial positions and they stay for longer. And also in terms of the civil service, there's a question here from Ben Eagle related to this, about getting people to stay within departments as well, so that expertise really builds up. And then a question from Kat Kisik, is there a particular issue within the food system which would bring more of a cross-departmental sort of leadership drive towards this?
The UK, I think, is unusually prone to ministerial churn, and we've been very unusually prone to ministerial churn because of the chaos of the last 7 years since the Brexit referendum, which has seen unprecedented ministerial churn. So hopefully one of the messages Keir Starmer, if he becomes Prime Minister, or indeed Rishi Sunak, if he returns, would have taken, is that we're now beyond churn. Coalition governments tend to be much more stable because they come in with an agreed programme for government and they've allocated the posts out. And indeed, that was the UK's experience in that period that we had of coalition government, that was much more stable. There are separate issues on civil service change. I mean, quite a few people do tend to stay in DEFRA, actually. It's just the tasks keep on changing and the political direction keep on changing. It is a department that actually a lot of people quite like working in, and people do tend to stay in post. But I think the political direction is a bigger problem in many ways there. It's quite interesting that Rachel Reeves' husband is now a second permanent secretary at DEFRA. He's the number 2 official. So, yeah, but I think that's probably more because the government thinks that it's a department that isn't very politically sensitive rather than anything else. So I'm not sure that's wholly a good sign, but at least it means that Rachel Reeves may be very aware of some of the challenges facing DEFRA. So I think it's sort of, yeah, it's a big difficult. There's big issues related to civil service pay, promotion, that if you're in a time when civil service pay is frozen, the only way you can get a pay increase is get yourself promoted. And that means you have to change jobs in our current system. You can't really get promoted in post. It's like not a thing. So there are some institutional issues that I think everybody agrees need to be tackled, and nobody is really tackling that. I think institutionally, what would be really, really interesting if you were trying to say, we are desperately going to have a mission-led government, is to think much more. We're not going to debate about the sort of measures in a sense, but we are going to have, we've called these the sort of climate cluster of departments, the sort of 5 departments that are named repeatedly as needing to act, plus the Treasury, and they will come together and agree the sort of best plan, agree the best allocation of funds, and go away and sort of jointly problem solve, rather than, what you might call the highest common factor approach to climate change, work out the sequencing things, and have that overseen, I think, by what you need, which is a much more powerful net zero unit in the Cabinet Office that can own the plan and develop the plan, support the plan, the way the Office for Climate Change used to do under David Miliband, but then ensure that people are doing their bit. So more from that, if you like, strategy unit, supporting the development of a cross-cutting strategy with associated funding, which is why you need the Treasury in the room, and then oversee delivery as well. And that's the way I would redo Whitehall to do that. I think the real danger is that agriculture, maybe, I'm not sure how much, if you talk to people doing net zero in Labour, how much agriculture would feature, and I'm not sure that it's seen as that much of a priority for net zero in the current government, notwithstanding what was in the 2021 net zero strategy.
Thank you. I've got a really interesting question here sent in from Tom McMillan, Plan Director of the Centre for Effective Innovation in Agriculture and Deputy Director of the National Innovation Centre for Rural Enterprise. To what extent do civil servants keep a wish list of policies that would be useful and potentially viable, but currently unpalatable politically or unviable economically, waiting for the right minister or government or conditions to come along? Do they do this in their heads in an informal kind of way, or is there good practice about keeping a kind of running register of policy options? I'm guessing, Jill, that's probably one for you.
That's interesting. I mean, one of the problems in the civil service, one of the really big problems, and problem ministers can complain about a lot, and it's variable in different areas. I think it's probably much less true on climate than some other areas, is that there is quite poor institutional memory. So not only do people not necessarily have a sort of big range of sort of, options we put forward before, they actually don't know what's been tried before and go back. They do, however, have quite good links into external players who do have more institutional memory. It's one of the reasons why, having research centres in universities is very important, because they can potentially be areas where institutional knowledge can be held and people can go and build those relationships, as long as there's enough trust to have those conversations between academics. And obviously, one of the UK's institutional strengths, I think, is the Climate Change Committee has, puts forward its own propositions as, these are some things you could do. You may not like these ideas. If you don't like them, come back with better ones. But this is our menu of options to reach these goals. So I think we do have those. In terms of other countries, there is a sort of, potential to look in the area of agriculture. Probably New Zealand is the country that's sort of trying, Neil will know more about this than me, that's, recognises has a really major problem with livestock for its net zero ambitions. So, there are regular sort of international gatherings where you can pick up on what's happening elsewhere. So there are looks around, but I think the real problem at the moment, for agriculture is that so much of the focus in new government will be on competing, what's the British version of the Inflation Reduction Act? How on earth is Labour going to meet its 2030 target on energy sector decarbonisation, et cetera, et cetera. And I think the real problem is this slips down the list as something that isn't going to get much cross-government attention, and therefore it focuses back into the energies inside a department, which, as I said, is, I think, quite conflicted and quite under pressure. But I'd be very interested in whether Neil agrees with any of that, because I don't know whether he does.
Yeah, I was thinking there's a literature in political science around the garbage can model. I don't know if you've ever heard of that. And that there are these sort of solutions that are all in the garbage can, and what are the conditions in which a problem kind of connects with a solution that already exists. And I think that's quite interesting. And I was struck when I was doing research for the book. Milton Friedman once said, "Only a crisis, actual or perceived, produces real change." And there's that sense that when you get a shock to the system, people will cast around for relatively ready-made solutions. And I think it's quite interesting what's happening in New Zealand, Netherlands as well, and even Ireland. There's quite a lot of floating of ideas around emissions from livestock in some economies that have got a real issue with livestock emissions. So stuff is moving on in other parts of the world. Difficult and coming up against all sorts of tricky political obstacles. But there's stuff to be learned from what's happening elsewhere, certainly.
Neil, a question for you. I'm sort of squishing a few together. There's one from Vicky Robinson here, and a few other people are talking about the private sector. You mentioned earlier in your talk, you were sort of talking about how after the Second World War, there was this sort of triad of, farmers and the private sector and government all sort of working together in this sort of mission-led drive. If that was to happen again, how would the private sector sort of be involved in a way that was really effective? Bearing in mind that, as I think both you and Jill have mentioned, the private sector is often ahead of the government on some of this already. What would be your thoughts on that?
Yes. So just picking up on what Jill said earlier about the sort of level of focus and priority around agriculture. Agriculture is 10-11% of our emissions. The food system as a whole is more like about 23%. And as energy and transport and the other things evolve and get fixed, so that proportion of the overall problem that is centered on the food system, that's going to grow. And I think Chris Skidmore said that agriculture could be 30% of emissions by 2030 in his net zero review. So I think that, over the next decade, the food system is going to become increasingly prominent, even if it's not up there yet. But from the private sector point of view, it's quite interesting because downstream of the farm, you've got a small number of very, very large companies that are processing and manufacturing and distributing food and selling it. Food retailing is very, very concentrated. And also upstream of the farm, the manufacturers of all of the main sort of sectors that supply agriculture with inputs, whether it be machinery, pesticides, animal feed, they're all very, very concentrated as well. But the meat in the sandwich, if you like, is this, plethora of family businesses that are price takers and don't have much control over what's going on, because the technologies that they use and adopt are coming from a very globally international corporate sector, and the stuff that they then supply into is quite highly concentrated, oligopolistic, really. So that's a paradox compared to energy that does make it quite thorny, because a lot of the change has to happen around land use and farming practice. It's about half of the emissions from the agri-food system.
So, Jess, I think it's a really interesting question where the pressure in the supply chain comes. I think at the moment what we see is the big supermarkets putting pressure on cost, and we see a lot of that they want to sort of contain costs that they have to charge consumers in the cost of living crisis. But I remember when I was at DEFRA in the 2000s, we were trying to come up with a food sector sustainability strategy or something like that. I'm not my team, another team. And we're talking to the food retailers, and it was going nowhere, and it was really going at the pace of the really, really slowest. And then some of the big retailers just pulled out and said, actually, they now saw this as a source of competitive advantage to push sustainability as one of their competitive offerings. And I think that's a really interesting model, because that's really where people see consumer advantage and saying, we genuinely are supplying food to you at much less environmental cost. And we saw a bit of that with the M&S or the Plan A. But then I think you get into the big greenwashing question of, if I'm going to be a consumer who is going to be driven by that, does the government have robust enough sort of accreditation auditing systems in place that I know that actually I am genuinely paying a bit extra for something that's much more environmentally friendly? So I think there's a really interesting dynamic between the private sector, the consumer, and all those people, various complicated people in the supply chain, because effectively we've contracted out quite a lot of the environmental management supply chain to the big supermarkets through assurance schemes and things like that.
There's quite an interesting one here from Simon Pearson. This would be to either of you. He's saying, my sense is that basic payment scheme payments that are made to farmers, the reduction of those will actually lead to the government having less influence over what farmers do. And we know that a lot of farmers are actually saying that, well, some are saying they think it's going to be more financial sense for them to not partake in a lot of those more environmentally focused schemes. Does that mean we're sort of, so there's something missing there? That's not the agricultural policy drive at the moment is actually weakening that sort of mission-led government in a sense? Neil, you might have thoughts on that.
Well, it's a sort of curious paradox of the whole Brexit saga that the common agricultural policy and how costly it was something that was played into the campaign for a leave vote. And then after Brexit, the commitment was to protect that level of spending for a period. And there are all sorts of organisations that are pressing quite hard to maintain that level of spending beyond the current commitment. The rationale for what it's spent on is changing, but the amount of money that's being spent is the same as under the Common Agricultural Policy at the moment. I think there's a question of whether that level of spending would actually be enough on its own to deliver the large-scale change in practice. We're in a mindset that was sort of forged from the mid-1980s onwards, that if you want farming to do different things, you have to develop a payment scheme to compensate farmers for farming in a less optimal way in production terms for the sake of the environmental benefits. So public money for public goods. That was something that was sort of developed within the Common Agricultural Policy to try and encourage less damage to some of the most sort of vulnerable environments, environmentally sensitive areas and so on. It's become more widespread. That model has kind of expanded. But accompanying that is regulatory rules. So on animal health and transport and disease, on water pollution, on pesticide use. There's a whole realm of production which is regulated because of health and environmental standards and animal disease. So you don't always necessarily have to just pay to change behaviour. You can change the law and change the rules as well. And there's a relationship between the two. You don't want to be paying farmers to do things which they're required to do by law. So there has to be a relationship between the sort of regulatory floor and the payments for more dramatic and radical change that brings more benefits above that regulatory floor. So I think you have to see the payments hand in hand with regulation.
And regulatory enforcement, which is the other bit, because we always know that cross-compliance was, your visit was once in every 140 years or something like that. I mean, it was quite poorly enforced. And I think there's a sort of big battle going on at the moment between DEFRA about how demanding can you make the conditionality on payments while still sort of getting farmers into the schemes. And there are real worries about uptake. Of course, if they're not in the scheme, then all you're relying on is your sort of minimum levels of regulation. So it's quite difficult to see where that's going to end up until we see how the final farm payment scheme comes in. And one of the things that has happened, though, is in order to preserve more money for sort of the successors to basic payment sustainable farm incentive, is we've seen a scaling back of the much more ambitious schemes around, we've lost the big local nature recovery schemes, which might have seen sort of big changes in land use. We still, I think, have landscape recovery, but the balance of funding is changing towards the lower end of the market. So it's a battle going on now, and I don't know whether there's any sort of ambition to change that post-election. But as I see, there'll be lots of other demands on those budgets as well from lots of other government departments. So,
Jill, I know you have to go to the cricket. Have you got time for one more question?
Yeah, no. I mean, cricket's at 12:30, so I'm good for a little bit. She said.
Okay, I just wanted to ask you, combine a couple here. One from Charles Godfrey, director of the Oxford Martin School. Given the important connections between food policy, health, environment, and climate change and rural policies, is it time for another cross-government initiative? And what, in your view, makes a cross-departmental initiative work or fail? And then I kind of wanted to combine that with one from Andy Georgian at UEA, who I think is with us right now. Are there any best practice examples in UK history or from other countries where lessons can be learnt, particularly in terms of those sort of cross-departmental work? And he's mentioned here Tony Blair's delivery unit led by Michelle Barber, or was that Michael Barber?
So I think deal with the delivery unit. I think you probably do need some sort of delivery unit around this, but I always thought the Michael Barber unit, speaking with someone from DEFRA, was very good at where there was a very clear public sector delivery chain. So it was good on hospital waiting targets, subject to people gaming the targets and systems being aware of that. But it was quite good on that sort of thing. It had much less to offer, and in our conversations at DEFRA, I found them really not very useful at all on our sort of biodiversity or climate change targets, because where you had sort of very complicated interaction with citizens, behaviour change and stuff like that, they really didn't have very much to bring to the party. So I think you do need somebody overseeing delivery, but it needs to be a much more sophisticated thing than certainly Barber One. It's a sort of big success story of early New Labour. I think it's really interesting, all these links with public health, because diet and obesity, the Institute for Government, Sophie Metcalfe's written a very good study about government repeat failures on obesity, which is the other sort of side of the story. And government's actually probably done better on net zero than it's done on obesity public health. I think they're really interesting questions about what's the right framing of some of these issues. How do you actually persuade people to do things if you're looking at public campaigns? I think there are clearly linkages that government should try to understand, but we have a real problem. I've talked about a real problem with DEFRA. I think there's a real problem with the Department of Health as well, that we don't actually have a real Department of Health. We have a department for the NHS, which is overwhelmingly dominated by managing the NHS, and public health is really a sort of slightly feeble afterthought there. Andrew Lansley, a weird set of names to say in the context of good governance, but he did have this idea that if his health reforms had worked, reader, they didn't, but if his health reforms had worked, that would free up the Department of Health from being totally focused on NHS management, which then be the task of this giant NDPB, NHS England, and would free up the department to become much more of a department of public health. One of my big frustrations when I was doing sustainable at DEFRA was we identified the Department of Health as a potential ally across a whole range of issues in that sort of health environment nexus, and we could never get them out to play on air quality, on fuel poverty, on a whole range of issues where we said, aren't our interests aligned? It was just, well, yeah, but we're not doing that now. So I think there is a real sort of bandwidth political interest problem. So I think if you want to do this, you want a prime minister who says, this is really matters to me, this is something I'm going to put my weight behind. Maybe you create a short-term special unit. The strategy unit under Tony Blair did some quite good stuff to produce something, but then you follow it through by tasking some people and say, your reputation will depend on doing this. You know, you can have resources, you can do this, and I want all of this done. But bits help, like putting in place legislative frameworks, oversight bodies and things like that to make the price of failing higher, but it does require concentrated effort over quite some time, and that's one thing our politics aren't very good at the moment.
You're on mute, Jez.
Sorry, waving around here. Now I was going to say, how bad do things have to get for, before, in terms of climate change and food insecurity, before DEFRA becomes this kind of heavyweight department where, the real heavyweight politicians are sort of sent there. But Neil, I wonder, do you have any thoughts on that earlier question about best practice from UK history or other countries in terms of that sort of, you talked earlier about sort of mission-led government, but sort of more cross-departmental sort of work.
Yeah, it complements what Jill said rather than is an alternative to it. I mean, food is quite important to all of us, and you're right. I think with what's happening in global climate change at the moment, there are real questions about supply chains and food prices. So we could see food becoming more important over the next 5 and 10 years, and that might lead to greater political emphasis. When I was in the Cabinet Office, I was in the Performance and Innovation Unit, which was the forerunner of the Strategy Unit. And it was at the time of the introduction of the 3-year comprehensive spending review system. And departments had public service agreements, which were signed off by the Treasury and I think number 10 in the Cabinet Office as well. Now they got quite elaborate, and it was criticised for targetry and lots and lots of targets. But each Secretary of State got a letter from the Prime Minister, which was a sort of contract that kind of agreed, these are the strategic priorities for your department. And so amongst the civil servants and the ministers, the key thing was sort of getting something in the public service agreement letter, which helped, really emphasise that was a key priority. And I think they were done away with, but it's a rather simple instrument but it's a way of ensuring that departments are tied into a cross-cutting goal across the whole of government. But I don't think that that's an alternative to really strong political leadership from the centre and strong political leadership within the department. I think you absolutely require those, but that's just a little sort of administrative technology that seemed very important at the time when I was there, and I think has sort of faded from our system.
Well, I mean, they were done away with by David Cameron, who thought they were sort of, too interfering with the sentence, and substituted with something called single departmental plans, and now have become something called outcome delivery plans, which I think are published. I think there may be unpublished versions as well, but which are pretty sort of bland. They're not as focused as the public service agreements were, but there were some problems with public service agreements. We at DEFRA, we used to own the public service agreement on climate change. It didn't particularly make the other departments that keen to play ball with us. until people got sort of, really interested in it. We had a disastrous thing which actually led to the Climate Change Act called the Climate Change Programme Review, where we couldn't get any sort of progress out of other government departments who didn't regard it as their priority. They regard it as DEFRA as a lead department. I owned the Public Service Agreement to deliver sustainable development at home and abroad, as measured by 15 headline indicators. If I'd really thought anyone was holding me to account for that, I certainly wouldn't have agreed to that public service agreement because it was completely impossible. And it's sort of rather altogether whacking by the global financial crisis in 2008, 2009, which sort of sideswiped much of those. So they work better, I think, in the public service delivery departments where they could be backed up by the delivery unit than for the more general ones. But I think actually, public tasking of Secretary of State and signalling, Alistair Campbell on his podcast was talking about the contract letters. Now, for some departments, those contract letters were written in the department and sent back to number 10 saying, this is what we'd like you to tell us to do. But they did give a sort of sense of government direction, and you don't necessarily get the same sense nowadays. You get the sense that, the government had to redo its climate change strategy after the High Court said it wasn't detailed enough to show that they actually had a plan that sort of lived up to their commitments. So I think, there are quite a lot of things you can put in place. In the first spending round, Neil will remember this, there was deemed to be really quite a good cross-cutting review of progress on children's services and young children, led by the number 2 economist at the Treasury, a guy called Norman Glass, who unfortunately died now. And that was seen to lay the foundations for a much more cross-government approach to younger children, early years and things like that. So there are things you can do, but they all, I think, come back to, is this seen as something where number 10 in particular is willing to invest some political capital? And I am quite worried at the way in which they've defined the mission around net zero, that it's very concentrated on the energy piece and not the other pieces of it.
We're running out of time. Well, we have run out of time, but if I can just ask 2 more questions, because we've still got almost 100 people here. So everyone's obviously very interested in what you guys are saying. Neil, are you okay for time, or do you have any other meetings or anything?
I haven't got any cricket to go to, but we're a bit worried about how far over we're going. But go ahead.
Don't worry. Well, lots of people are still here. So I'm just going to ask 2 more questions. So Tim Benton says, if government has effectively allowed us to reach dangerous climate change and go over the 1.5 degrees, what does that mean for domestic and international politics? Jill, do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I think, obviously it comes back, it's not just our government, it's governments, because it has to be a global thing. But I think one of the things we do need to look at, we've talked very much about DEFRA and the agricultural transition, but the other side of that is also DEFRA is supposed to be the lead department on adaptation to climate change. That's going to have very significant implications, I think, for the way in which we farm, what we farm and things like that. But it has big implications across Whitehall. And I think one of the things that the Institute for Government, we're having to do a bit of work on, if anyone's interested, we're having to do a bit of work on this autumn, is where should adaptation sit in government? Because I don't think DEFRA is capable in its present form of leading a real serious cross-government effort on climate change. And if the Climate Change Committee is a bit negative about progress on emissions reduction, you should read their reports on adaptation, which they repeatedly say is the complete Cinderella. So I think, a lot of people say you shouldn't do adaptation because it means you're giving up on net zero. But the truth is that you need to do both. And we aren't well set up to do the latter at all.
So last question from Charlotte, which is for most of the academics, I guess, in the room. What do you think are the glaring gaps in research on this topic that need doing? I know, Neil, you'll have thoughts.
Well, that's exactly what the work of this network is all about. So we're funded through to 2025 to engage with the academic and research community and agri-food industry stakeholders and and the voluntary sector around that very issue. So we're working continually to review what sort of research takes place and where there are gaps. I guess a headline from the about 12 months of work we've been doing so far is that a lot of the research does seem to be locked within a sort of business as usual kind of mindset. It takes our current economic system, our political institutions, and our sort of current approach to agriculture and land as a sort of starting point and a given, and works within that. And I think that there's probably less intellectual firepower at the moment aimed at system change and thinking about how the world might be a different kind of place in 5, 10, 15 years time, and how we develop a transition that is sort of robust and resilient to shocks to the system. So thinking systemically and thinking about the way the wider world is changing, international geopolitics, AI, the big sort of technological trends, et cetera, and trying to bring that to bear on what research councils are funding and other organisations are thinking about, what we need to be studying and working on in the next 2 or 3 years.
What about you, Jill? If you had a good few million to direct at funding all of this, what would you fund research into?
I'm not going to answer that question, because one of the things that we discovered when I was at DEFRA was that we had a massive back catalogue of research that we had in the past commissioned, because it was easy to get money for research, but it wasn't easy to get money for the administration to disseminate that research. We actually got someone to look through our back catalogue to make sure that we weren't recommissioning the same research time and time again, which I think we were to an extent, and that we also had gone through that and fully audited what we had. So my starting point would be to actually do a proper mapping. I think it's really interesting that the government just put out yesterday, the day before, Neil will probably know, the ESRC, Stian Westlake, who's now the chair, just put out the sort of composite guide of all the government's areas of research interest, which is what government departments say to the academic community, these are the areas we're interested in. So I do recommend to anyone to look at those. And actually, if you think there are things that they're missing, perhaps get in touch with the chief scientific advisors or chief directors of analysis and say, we think you also need to be looking at this. But I think that's a really good starting point for whatever. But as I said, the real issue in Whitehall is more using the research that it's already got before it gets on to pushing loads of new stuff.
Brilliant. Okay, we've run over by 15 minutes, but thank you, Neil and Jill, for staying on. Yeah, like I said, there was a good lot of almost 100 people still on wanting to listen to you guys. So thank you so much for your talks. Thanks for addressing all the questions. Sorry we've not managed to answer all the questions. There have been quite a lot, but we will we'll see if we can do something about that, get some of those answered in another way. Hope you enjoyed the webinar. If you want to re-watch it to digest things a little bit more, we'll be putting it on our website, on our YouTube channel, where you can also browse our back catalogue of webinars and all sorts of related topics to net zero and the food system, including poverty and food choices, retailer greenhouse gas emissions, agroforestry, carbon markets, and more. I think my colleague John is going to put the links in the chat again just now. Our next webinar is going to be in mid-October, and will be a joint one with the National Federation of Young Farmers Clubs, where we'll be hearing from 2 young farmers about their thoughts and feelings on taking us as being the generation that will take us through to net zero by 2050. Finally, we welcome any comments and suggestions for speakers, topics, podcast interviewees. So do get in touch with myself or Neil, and I think John will also put our email addresses in the chat. Oh yeah, there it is. Brilliant. Okay, thanks very much, everybody, and we'll see you in October. All right, thank you. Thanks, Jill. Thanks, Neil.